January 2021. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg rules that Russia should be held accountable for crimes committed during its invasion of Georgia and South Ossetia 13 years earlier. These include acts of ethnic cleansing, torture, and ill treatment. But this is a forlorn attempt to try to uncover what really happened during one of the murkiest episodes in recent European history.
Moscow's will and capacity to use force, if need be, to ensure that the countries in its immediate environment that it regards as properly within its sphere of influence cannot and do not break away.
August 2008. Russian troops fight against the army of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. The Russians claim they are supporting the independence uprisings in South Ossetia, a region that for years has wanted to break away from the Georgian state.
Russia has invaded a sovereign neighboring state and threatens a democratic government elected by its people.
While the tensions between Russia and Georgia go back centuries, the primary objective behind the Russian invasion in 2008 is still unclear. Many suspect the Kremlin was just testing how far the West would go to support its allies in the region.
What the invasion did for Putin was test international resolve. How willing were those members to use military force to prevent the Kremlin's ambition?
The region to the south of the Russian border, known as the Caucasus, is where Europe meets Asia. The nations that occupy the South Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia all have a rich and turbulent history, dating back centuries.
The first kingdom of Abkhazia established itself in the 8th century. And for a long time, it was a very powerful Christian kingdom, which was not conquered by the Arabs during the big Arab conquest of this area.
The people we know today as South Ossetians were an ancient and medieval Iranian nomadic people. In the Middle Ages, they fled to the North Caucasus to escape the marauding Turkish-Mongol invasions. Ever since, Abkhazians and South Ossetians have, from time to time, nurtured ambitions to gain their independence from Georgia. In 1921, the Soviet Red Army invaded Georgia, establishing it as a Russian satellite state. In recognition of the support the Ossetians lent the Bolsheviks during their rise to power, the Soviets established South Ossetia as an autonomous oblast within the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. This split the country in two, aggravating tensions between Georgians and Ossetians.
There are two Ossetias. There is North Ossetia, which is a part of the Russian Federation, and it was a part of the Russian Federation during the Soviet times. And then there is a South Ossetia, which was a part of Georgia, of the Republic of Georgia, as part of the Soviet Union. What separates these two Ossetias are actually mountains. So South Ossetia is closer to Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, than to other autonomous republics of the Russian Federation.
The era of Soviet socialism in Georgia was characterized by rapid urbanization, industrialization, and rampant corruption. Widespread bribery by party officials stoked resentment and bitterness within the country's different factions. More than 50 years later, under Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, Georgia was moving towards independence. At the same time, however, South Ossetia saw its opportunity to break away from Georgia and unite with North Ossetia. In September 1990, South Ossetia formally declared its independence from Georgia. In response, Georgia sent in troops to enforce its sovereignty, and armed clashes followed. In April 1991, in the face of the imminent dissolution of the USSR, Georgia declared its independence from the Soviet Union.
The first president of independent Georgia was Ziad Gamzahurdia. Ziad Gamzahurdia for a long time was a dissident, under the Soviet regime. While he very much proclaimed, being a Democrat and fought for the freedom of Georgia, for the freedom of speech, he ended up establishing a dictatorial rule. What probably led to his demise was the strong nationalism.
Gamzahurdia repressed separatists and imprisoned opponents, popularizing the slogan, "Georgia for Georgians." He fueled ethnic division and conflict. His dictatorial rule pushed the opposition towards open revolt, and by the end of the year, a civil war had broken out. In December 1991, Gamzahurdia was violently deposed, triggering running battles in the Georgian capital of Tbilisi. When Gamzahurdia fled the country on July 6, 1992, some Georgians started to dream of a better future by allying themselves with NATO and the West.
Now it must be democracy.
But before these ideas could take hold, the country's governance was taken over by a military council.
We are very far away from democracy, from real democracy. Now people are holding rifles, heavy machine guns, so it's very difficult now to speak about democracy.
A council of state was formed, headed by Edward Shevardnadze, Gorbachev's former foreign minister and former first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party.
With the certainly support of Moscow, basically Shevardnadze is introduced as a figure that can establish some peace, some stability, and he becomes the president. He was able to produce some kind of economic reforms, also political reforms. However, what he was not able to do is to uproot corruption, nepotism. He was partly successful, partly not.
With his background at the heart of the Soviet establishment, Shevardnadze would need to work overtime to win the trust of the new Georgia. The armed clashes that had started in South Ossetia in 1990 continued until June 1992, when Georgian nationalists and Ossetian separatists agreed to an uneasy ceasefire. The very next month, however, Abkhazia declared independence from Georgia, creating further instability in the region.
Very few countries recognize it as this microstate which has a big clash with Georgia and also supported by the Russian Federation.
With Gorbachev's former foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, now de facto ruler of the country, Georgia's political allegiance moved back towards the Kremlin. In December 1993, it joined the Commonwealth of Independent States of the former Soviet republics, or CIS. Some months later, in May 1994, a ceasefire was signed in Moscow between the Georgians and the Abkhazians. Although he had been in power for some years, it was not until 1995 that Shevardnadze was formally elected president of Georgia. 5 years later, in April 2000, he would be elected for a second term. Conflicts between government forces and the separatist factions and regions continued throughout his presidency. And tensions arose with Russia when they accused the Georgian government of harboring Chechen separatists on Russia's southern border. The tensions coincided with the arrival of Russia's new ruler, Vladimir Putin.
Putin came to power in the year 2000. He has been seeking to redefine Russia's place within the post-Soviet state, the countries that the Russians themselves call the near abroad.
With the tension ratcheting up, Vladimir Putin sent a letter to the UN Security Council stating that Georgia must respond to the accusations of harboring Chechen rebels or face military action from Russia. Shevardnadze denied he had provided any help to the Chechens, but the tension diminished only when the Georgian authorities agreed to provide military support to Russia in their war in Chechnya. Even as he managed to stabilize Georgia's frayed relationship with Russia, however, Shevardnadze's grip on power was weakening. He tried to stimulate the Georgian economy with measures such as the construction of the Baku-Tbilisi-Cheyan oil pipeline, but that again fell foul of the new regime in Moscow.
During the Soviet period, anything that was taken from the Caspian Sea went through the Soviet Union. Along with Azerbaijan and with Turkey, they came up with this massive pipeline, over 1,700 kilometers long, that allowed them to take charge of their own energy security and make money from that vital fossil fuel that came from that strategically important region. Now, obviously, Russia are not very happy about this, and they refuse to be part of anything that cuts them out of the bidding.
Despite Shevardnadze's best efforts, Georgia's growing economic crisis eventually sapped his support. His downfall was inevitable. The catalyst for his overthrow was a deeply suspect parliamentary election in 2003, which Georgians believed had been rigged by Shevardnadze loyalists. A series of popular protests subsequently erupted. Known as the Rose Revolution, demonstrators entered parliament with roses in their hands.
It was so dramatic, it was so beautiful, it was so emotional that I cannot explain.
You've got to frame this revolution in the post-Cold War context. So Russia was still trying to keep its spheres of influence and that buffer between Russia and the West, between Russia and NATO, whereas NATO was seeking to expand. They wanted to bring Georgia on board, closer to the West.
By the end of these peaceful protests, a change of government was inevitable. With Shevardnadze's resignation, an election was called which took place in early 2004. It was won by Mikhail Saakashvili, a pro-NATO politician who promised to restore Georgia's territorial integrity and re-establish relations with the West. Georgia began to enact liberal economic reforms and changes to its constitution. Economic reforms followed with the privatization of state enterprises and the inauguration of the Baku-Tbilisi-Cheyan oil pipeline. Georgian troops even fought alongside American forces in the Iraq War of 2003.
Well, Saakashvili was trying to create a situation where he could unite Georgia. So he was trying to shut down on separatism in South Ossetia, whilst also trying to create new economic ties for Georgia that were away from Russia. So this necessitated being closer to the West.
The United States recognizes the strategic significance of Georgia, and it supports the aspiration of the Georgians for Euro-Atlantic integration and also to be a part of NATO.
With this new alignment, Georgia's relations with Putin's Russia became strained once more. In 2006, Georgian authorities uncovered a Russian espionage network covertly investigating Georgian defense capabilities. As a result, the government detained 4 Russian intelligence officers. The Kremlin responded by deporting Georgian citizens from Russia. The thin thread between Russia and Georgia was getting close to breaking point. At the same time, pressure internally in Georgia was increasing from separatist movements in Ossetia. In November 2006, South Ossetians voted overwhelmingly for independence in a referendum that Georgia quickly declared illegal. Saakashvili claimed that the Russians were financing the separatist movements with the hidden intention of annexing these pro-independence regions. With tensions rising, Georgia sent troops into South Ossetia. Russia, in turn, increased the presence of its so-called peacekeepers in the region. Months of skirmishes followed between Russian-backed South Ossetian independence fighters and Georgian troops. In 2007, Georgia expanded its military spending exponentially in an attempt to meet the NATO entry-level requirements. For Putin, this was the final straw.
President Putin, who was elected in March 2000, had long resented any attempts by NATO or the EU to expand into its former Soviet zones of influence. And it's for this reason, as tensions started to mount, that you had Russia moving its forces towards Georgia's borders, and of course you had Georgia doing the same.
From April 2008, the Russian government gave full overt cooperation to the separatist governments of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That same month, after the postponement of Georgia's admission to NATO, the country accused Russia of shooting down a drone on Georgian soil. An email later published by WikiLeaks claimed that assistance to Russia in this military operation came from an unlikely source. It stated that Israeli authorities may have supplied the codes for Georgian unmanned aerial vehicles to Russia in exchange for information on Iranian missile systems. It would not be long before President Saakashvili would take actions that would give Russia the perfect pretext to invade.
It's clear that the Russians had been expecting and planning for the war in Georgia. They didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. But nonetheless, they had been encouraging their proxies, their allies in South Ossetia, to keep needling the Georgians with a whole variety of sometimes terrorist attacks, sometimes cross-border artillery bombardments. And they knew that Mikhail Saakashvili, the Georgian leader, was a volatile man who at some point was going to succumb to the temptation to send in his troops and give Russia the pretext for its operation.
In the months leading up to August 2008, the Russo-Georgian border had become increasingly militarized. In July, the incursion of several Russian aircraft into South Ossetia had been condemned by the Georgian government as an act of open aggression. Russia stated the overflight of its aircraft had only been carried out to deter a possible Georgian offensive into South Ossetia.
In the lead up to 2008, we'd actually had an increasing tempo of attacks by South Ossetian militants against the Georgians. And eventually, Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili decided that enough was enough, and he deployed his troops to, as he saw it, bring South Ossetia back into the fold.
In the early hours of the 8th of August 2008, a coordinated Georgian military offensive was launched, aimed at seizing South Ossetia's capital, Tskhinvali. This outright attack by Georgia gave the Kremlin the perfect pretext for an invasion. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev ordered the immediate deployment of its troops and tanks. He also carried out a series of massive bombing raids on the Georgian military bases in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, claiming that the lives and dignity of Russian peacekeeping troops must be respected no matter where they are. Georgia had begun an air and ground attack, but once Russian tanks rolled in, they were quickly outgunned, outmanned, and overpowered.
In many ways, the 2008 war was the culmination of a long process. Ossetians had regarded themselves as a separate people from the Georgians, so basically this was a war that was going to happen at some point.
NATO, and in particular the United States and Great Britain, called for an immediate ceasefire between the two nations.
Russia has invaded a sovereign neighboring state and threatens a democratic government elected by its people. Such an action is unacceptable in the 21st century.
Along with the Russian troops, the Kremlin's attack also included a new kind of warfare, one that the Georgian military was powerless to resist.
Georgia was the first time that a nation-state witnessed the cyber capabilities that Russia had been developing used en masse. And their utility was eye-watering. Not just in terms of military disruption of communication networks, but in particular, the disruption and the harm for civilians, from the crippling of online banking systems to the crashing of government websites. The cyber attacks lasted for weeks and weeks.
Weeks before war broke out, Russian hackers attacked by overloading and disabling many official and non-official websites with what is known as zombie computers. The attack took down hundreds of websites, including Georgia's presidential website and the Georgian national TV broadcaster, shutting down the country's main servers.
Members of NATO were sent to help shore up the defenses of Georgia and to provide training and expertise to try to resist potential future attacks from Russia. It demonstrated a new frontier in conflict and warfare, and one that NATO simply didn't have the tools or the legal doctrines to properly respond to at the time.
Who was really to blame for this conflict? Was it Georgia, in the hope that by provoking Russia, it would propel them into the arms of NATO? Was it the Ossetian separatists, agitating for their long-sought-after independence? Or was it Putin, who saw it as a perfect pretext to annex more territory and further reinforce Russia's defensive borders against NATO? With Georgia battling Ossetian separatists and Russian troops, a peacekeeping commission from the United States and the European Union left for the former Soviet Republic, with the intention of mediating between the parties involved in the conflict.
The international community reacted in some ways quite predictably. There was a mix of outrage and horror. They didn't really expect that the Russians would deploy forces into Georgia. When it became clear quite what was happening, there was a big international push, particularly by the French, to try and broker some kind of a ceasefire.
But the reaction of the international community was neither strong nor swift enough to bring about an immediate ceasefire. By the 10th of August, the Russian militia took complete control of the Ossetian capital, Tskhinvali, forcing Georgian troops to retreat to the town of Gori. Many inhabitants of Gori evacuated the city for fear of the advancing troops, who were pushing into central Georgia. The Georgian authorities announced that they were ready and willing to engage in peace talks, but the Russian government did not respond, and as the casualties continued to mount, announced that they would not back down until South Ossetia's protection from Georgian aggression was guaranteed.
The UK condemns the violence in South Ossetia because of the appalling effects it's having, on innocent civilians in particular. There have been far too many casualties from this violence, and there are a lot of people now being displaced.
On August the 12th, with Russian forces continuing to advance into Georgia, President Medvedev met with French President Nicolas Sarkozy to discuss a diplomatic agreement to end hostilities in the region.
France in particular emerged as the key driver of the ceasefire, and to a large extent this seems down to the French President Sarkozy's desire to be seen as a great power broker on the world stage. And that's always a dangerous thing, because when you actually have a world leader who has thrown his or her reputation behind a particular initiative, he needs or she needs to have some kind of a positive outcome. This actually was a problem. The French then ended up blessing a ceasefire, which basically allowed the Russians to get away with their invasion.
The United States and Britain blamed Russia for the escalation of the conflict.
I've said to President Medvedev very directly that Russian aggression is something that has been condemned throughout the world. And I think it's absolutely clear to us that while Georgia had offered a ceasefire, it has taken time for Russia to respond. Now that they have responded, this must not be a temporary ceasefire, it must be a lasting ceasefire.
US President George W. Bush announced that his Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, would leave immediately on a diplomatic mission to the region to seek lasting peace.
All Russian troops and any irregular and paramilitary forces that entered with them must leave immediately.
But despite there being a suspension of hostilities, the conflict was far from over. On the 13th of August, a contingent of Russian troops still occupied the city of Gori. 3 days later, on the 16th of August, a ceasefire was finally signed by Presidents Saakashvili and Medvedev. The agreement stipulated that Russia was to withdraw its troops from Georgia, but that it should still be allowed to patrol inside the country. It was agreed that Russia would begin to withdraw its troops on the 18th of August. But in the days that followed, there was little sign that the Russians were packing up and heading home. 4 days later, under threat of NATO-backed retaliation, Russian troops finally began to withdraw from Gori. On the 26th of August, in a parting shot, Russian President Medvedev signed an order recognizing the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent nations and guaranteeing their protection. Russian military bases were then established in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, on the grounds that they would prevent Georgia from trying to regain control of the areas. 2 months after the beginning of the war of 2008, with nearly 1,000 dead and several thousand more wounded, Russia finally withdrew most of its forces, but their settlements in Abkhazia and South Ossetia remain to this day. On December 2nd, 2008, the European Union commissioned an independent report to determine responsibility for the conflict. In September 2009, it stated that the Russian-Georgian conflict left about 850 dead and some 35,000 Georgians homeless, displacing more than 190,000 people.
The consequences for Georgia as a state was that it actually lost the last remnants of control over both South Ossetia and the other breakaway region of Abkhazia on the coast.
The report blamed both sides for the conflict. It found that while Georgia had initiated the war against South Ossetia, Russia had long provoked it and had reacted disproportionately to Georgia's military operations. The United Nations issued a report that categorically refuted Russia's claim that the military intervention had been for humanitarian reasons.
Today, Russia says it is fighting in defense of Russian citizens in South Ossetia. Who will they claim to be defending tomorrow? Russians in the Ukraine? Russians in the Baltic states, who are, remember, already members of the EU and NATO? Russians in Central Asia? This is a dangerous doctrine with worrying echoes from the darkest chapters of European history.
Since the 2008 war ended, a massive evidence has emerged which suggests that Russia had planned the invasion long before South Ossetian separatists launched their first attack. In the month prior to the outbreak of the war, the Russian army conducted military exercises in the North Caucasus region, close to the Georgian border, with some of the units that would later invade the country. The exercise, called Kavkaz 2008, took place with 8,000 soldiers, 30 fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters, and 700 vehicles, all rehearsing scenarios of a military operation in Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
The Russians say that they just simply responded to what happened in South Ossetia. However, first of all, they had just been completing military exercises which allowed them to make sure they had troops in the area all ready to roll. forces do not just suddenly move out of their base on day one of an operation unless they're precisely prepared for it. And finally, we have the examples that have come out of South Ossetia. The Russians and the Russian military command may well be very tight-lipped, but the South Ossetian militants were often much less so, and they actually quite openly said that, yes, of course, the Russians are ready to help us at a moment's notice, and they're waiting for it. So I think one way or the other, we're piecing it together, the Russian claims that it came as a surprise to them ring very hollow.
As early as 2007, Russia had withdrawn from the European Conventional Forces Treaty. This had limited the number of troops between the Ural Mountains and the Atlantic seaboard. Removing it was a necessary first step in any invasion plan in the Caucasus. According to many, Georgia's failure to successfully join NATO in April 2008 may have emboldened the Russian government and persuaded them to act before it was too late and Georgia was out of reach. Whatever the reality, the West was caught flat-footed by the boldness and speed of the Russian offensive.
What do you do when a big country like Russia, which is essentially throwing its weight around in its neighborhood, deploys troops in a very quick war in a country far away from NATO, far away from Europe? In practical terms, what else could the international community have done? They couldn't have sent troops to Georgia. But by the time it had begun to get its act together, the war was already over. And when it comes down to it, it doesn't matter whether it's Russia, whether it's China, or whether it's other countries that have at different times thrown their weight around. The international community has proven to be relatively toothless.
There has been much speculation about a trap having been very cleverly set by Russia. And when Georgia attacked South Ossetia, it played directly into Russia's hands. Russia's decisive intervention in the 2008 conflict between Georgia and the Ossetians gave her the perfect opportunity to flex her military muscles and win popularity at home, as well as boosting her profile and prominence on the world stage.
The idea that the Russian state requires external enemies in order to solidify its domestic audience and to give justification for its arms buildups has been a key part of Soviet foreign policy and the West's understanding of how it behaves. The Putin regime was essentially looking for a foreign distraction, it was looking for a way to rally its public behind it, and it was looking to test international frontiers and boundaries and to see just how much it could flex its muscles and expand.
With the fragile ceasefire in the Caucasus, another battle began. A public relations war. Both Russia and Georgia invested huge sums in aggressive marketing and PR to justify their actions to the international community. The Abkhazian and South Ossetian authorities hired American PR agencies, as did the Russian government. Georgia, meanwhile, retained a London PR firm led by a former political editor of the Sunday Times. Russia's PR campaign was headlined by the claim that their invasion was justified on the basis that Georgia was brutally suppressing a peacefully protesting people. Georgia, meanwhile, claimed it was they who were the injured party and the victims of very obvious Russian aggression. Though crude in its methods, the geopolitical and strategic triumph was indisputably Russia's.
All the international community managed to do was to retrospectively provide some kind of rationale for what the Russians had already done. They clearly were not about to go and invade the rest of Georgia. They came in, they consolidated their hold over South Ossetia, they pushed a little bit further just to make the point that they could, and then they withdrew.
Russia had managed to consolidate its position in the region and, at the same time, highlight the powerlessness of the West.
The lesson that Moscow learned was that if you act decisively, if you act fast, if you essentially change the facts on the ground quickly, before anyone else really has a chance to respond at the usual slow pace of diplomatic negotiations, then in a way you can get away with, well, quite literally murder in some cases, but certainly war and annexation in others.
and there was a further major economic benefit to Russia which had yet to be fully realized. At 1,768 kilometers, the Baku-Tbilisi-Cheyan pipeline, which was opened in Georgia 3 years before the conflict and became operational in 2006, is the second longest in the world. This pipeline was the only way to export oil to Europe from the Caspian Sea without involving Russia. Just days before the outbreak of the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, the pipeline was attacked in the section that passes through eastern Turkey. In 2014, an investigation determined that the pipeline explosion was caused by hacking into the computer system that controls it. US intelligence agencies believe that the perpetrators were none other than their Russian counterparts, a claim Russia has strenuously denied. In 2015, the fence marking South Ossetia's border was moved inside Georgia to the point where it incorporated more than a kilometer section of the pipeline. This meant that South Ossetia and, in effect, Russia, now had a stake in its activities. This appropriation of Georgian territory was in direct contravention of the ceasefire terms agreed 7 years earlier.
More South Ossetians, for example, getting Russian passports so that they become formally Russian citizens, which means that Russia always has an excuse to defend them. And also a slight effort to push back the borders of South Ossetia. People will try and move border markers just to get an extra little sliver of land, and then next week maybe another sliver of land. So although obviously there is still distinct sort of grounds for trouble in the region, at the moment the status quo is fixed.
In 2016, the International Criminal Court in The Hague found reasonable grounds to authorize an investigation into possible war crimes by the Russian and Georgian governments in 2008. 2 years before, Georgia had already won the first legal battle when the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg ruled that the arrest, detention, and collective expulsion of Georgians from Russia violated the European Convention of Human Rights. In 2019, the court ruled Russia had to pay 10 million euros in compensation for damages related to that mass deportation. And in January 2021, after a 12-year legal battle, Georgia finally won a third trial against Russia in the European Court. In an historic adjudication, the court ruled that Moscow was indeed responsible for human rights violations during the war in South Ossetia. But none of this has changed the new realities in the region.
At the moment in Georgia, there are frozen conflicts. I mean, South Ossetia and Abkhazia are both now really pseudo-states, unrecognized states that only Russian military and economic support keeps alive. But on the other hand, this is unlikely to change. Tbilisi is not going to abandon its claims to these territories. The Russians aren't going to abandon their willingness to protect them, but neither side at the moment is willing or wants to create any more conflict.
It is unclear what will happen in the future between the two countries, the disputed territories, and their ongoing conflicts. But one thing is clear. Russia's dominance in the region has been ever greater since the war of 2008, and they are showing no signs of leaving any time soon.
In many ways, the Russian invasion of Georgia served as a testbed for what would later come with Crimea. Various weapon systems were tested for the first time, along with shock tactics, cyber warfare techniques, and new methods of causing confusion amongst the populace were experimented with and later honed, not just for the Crimea, but more broadly against Ukraine as a whole. But perhaps most importantly, what the invasion did for Putin was test international resolve, especially that of NATO members. And the message that came from that attack was that Russia could push and expand, and that there was very little pushback and resistance from a distracted and disunited NATO.
Despite all the setbacks and the difficulties with its much larger, all-powerful neighbor, Georgia is still trying to strengthen its ties with the West.
Georgia still has very high hopes to become a member of NATO. The problem is that this is clearly one of Russia's red lines, first of all. And secondly, Georgia is a fair way away. It's not part of Europe in the sense of contiguous land border with any other NATO member states. The key element of NATO is what's called Article 5, the central element which basically says an attack on one NATO member state is an attack on all. And it depends on that being a credible deterrent. The trouble is with Georgia, I mean, can we really imagine that, for example, if the Russians rolled into Georgia, that NATO forces would try and attack Russia from the West? It seems very implausible. And therefore, there is a big concern, actually, amongst NATO commanders that if Georgia were allowed in, it actually would undermine the credibility of the whole NATO alliance.
This is a problem not only for Georgia. Every time that a neighboring country of Russia aspires to turn their sights westward, conflicts emerge.
It's argued that if NATO and the US had acted more robustly in reaction to Russia's advances into Georgia, then you might not have had the annexation of Crimea 6 years later. But the simple answer to this is that the US was never going to risk going to war with Russia over Georgia. And that is a lesson that is still being learnt in that region today. And it's a lesson that was so clearly learnt in Ukraine as well, when President Obama made a similar decision not to invade and risk war with Russia.
In the wake of the attack on Georgia, President Putin made it clear to the president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili at the time, Putin had said directly to Saakashvili, your Western allies, your Western partners promised a great deal. They didn't deliver. I threatened, I delivered. So Putin is always looking out to see if there is any hint that we will not follow through on promises that we have made, because he will always follow through on a threat, as indeed he ultimately did. He threatened Ukraine in 2008, and it wasn't until 2014 when Ukraine tried to conclude an association agreement with the European Union that he struck.
Putin has stayed true to his word. Hostilities persist in Ukraine today, suggesting that Russian interference in surrounding countries is far from over. It will continue for as long as it serves his purpose of consolidating and expanding his power base abroad, whilst discouraging the West and NATO from interfering in Russia's backyard.